All right, it's officially 6:30, so I'll start the meeting. Welcome everyone to this meeting of Carpinteria Birdwatchers for August 2024. Um, a quick announcement. So we will not be having a Carpinteria Birdwatchers outing this Saturday. It will be delayed until the following Saturday. So Saturday, August 24th, we'll have an outing at 8 a.m. at the Carpinteria Salt Marsh off Ash Avenue. You can go to carpbirdwatchers.org for details about that. Hope to see people then. But again, not this Saturday. I mean, you can go birdwatch at the Salt Marsh this Saturday if you want. I'm sure there's great stuff to be there, but I will not be there. Um, okay, and then I think that's it for announcements. And I want to get right into the meeting because it's a very special meeting that I'm excited about. Tonight's meeting is on the topic of status and distribution and what it can teach birdwatchers and why it's important for birdwatchers to know about that. And we have our very special guest tonight, Paul Lehman, who probably knows more about bird status and distribution than anyone else who's ever graced certainly a meeting of Carpinteria Birdwatchers and probably any. So thank you very much, Paul, for being part of this meeting.
Sure. Um, I guess what I'm going to do is talk about status distribution, identification, pitfalls, and the more local scene in Santa Barbara with status distribution, how you learn about it, but also the work that I started, but others have continued since on keeping track of records here. So you learn about status and distribution in Santa Barbara County. And so just some really quick history, it's boring, but so I moved to Santa Barbara when I was 18 as a freshman at UCSB way back, oh Lord, 1974. And back in those days, in the 70s, it was very difficult to learn because there weren't any books out. There was a little bar chart book on the birds of the Santa Barbara region, a little book that a guy named T. Nelson Metcalf did with the help of a young Turk named Richard Webster, who had just left for college out of Santa Barbara then. But he used the typical bar graphs through the year, and it was a 50-mile radius around Santa Barbara. But that was about the only source there was back then. And one way you really learned about status distribution, occurrence of rarities, was through the magazine or journal North American Birds, which was first called Audubon Field Notes, then American Birds, then North American Birds. And the regional editor for the whole Southern California area was a guy named Guy McCaskey, lived in San Diego. He's still alive, and he still does the report, co-authors it with Kimball Garrett from Los Angeles. And back then, everybody got that magazine. Now they don't, but they did then because it was the only way to get that information. There was no internet, of course, no computers, no eBird. And back then, people would mail Guy their sightings, in a letter, once a month or so. Here's what I saw. There wasn't even email, of course. Nobody had personal computers till, the early 80s or so at the earliest. So it became unwieldy. Guy got personal letters from every bird watcher who would send stuff. So that he started what's called the county coordinator idea. And he got one person, he thought the best person in each county, to do that on the county scale and then submit a county report to him at the end of the season. Much more wieldy to use that than obviously everybody's sending their stuff willy-nilly. So I became the first county coordinator for Santa Barbara County. That was 1979. And I was the county coordinator until I left Santa Barbara to go back east in 1994. At that point, Joan Lentz took my place, and she was the county coordinator for about 5 years. And then about 5 years later, she gave it up and gave it to Dave Compton, who now for over 20 years has had that role. And it's a thankless task. But that was like the only way to get the info. So now you have gobs more data. I mean, the volume of data is massively more now than you had. There are more birders, and it's much easier to share that information, of course. Back then, there were all sorts of people who were very low-key birders, maybe only looked at the feeder in their backyard. And if they saw a male rose-breasted grosbeak at their feeder, they may or may not be tied into the birding community to report it to anybody, or they just kept it to themselves. Oh, that's nice. Or what's that bird? Or here's a photo of a hummingbird that has blue and green on it with an orange bill, and they wouldn't know who to report it to. Well, now that doesn't happen nearly as much. So the sharing of that kind of information of bird occurrence has just exploded, of course, in the decades compared to a long time ago.
And Paul, could I jump in for one
Yeah.
quick second? I want to let people know that I want there to be an opportunity for people to have Q&A and back and forth. And I've kind of planned it out that the first half of the meeting, we're going to sort of talk about status and distribution resources more generally. And then in the second half, we'll talk more specifically about particular species that are challenging or that require a certain understanding of status and distribution to do a good job of identifying them. I mean, to the extent we can keep it corralled into two halves. But at the end of each of those two halves, I want to have just an official Q&A period so people can ask questions then. And I'm reserving the right for me to kind of jump in with a little question right now, but I just want to mention to people that if you have questions during the discussion, you can use the Zoom meeting chat to post them, and then we'll get to them during that official Q&A period. Or you can just remember them, and when we get to the Q&A period, we'll announce that, and then you can unmute and share your questions then. But one question I had before you get too far on from the olden days, because I find the olden days very interesting. That was when I started bird watching, and a lot of what you're talking about is very nostalgic for me. I remember the first time I birded with Guy McCaskey, and he showed up at this, event where I was bird watching, and I was like, oh my gosh, Guy McCaskey. I was like, 15. But it is amazing that, I think of myself as of a certain age now, and he's still going strong out there, but he was going strong then too. I am curious. So when you talk about like 1979, you were going through your academic career at UC Santa Barbara, and you were studying biogeography. I mean, as an academic pursuit. And I'm just really curious, what was it about that was interesting to you? Why did you choose to do your graduate work in that area? Was it that you were a birder and this was just a way to kind of excuse?
Yeah, funny you should add. That was exactly my next thing I was going to segue in. So I came to Santa Barbara as a freshman. My first 2 years at UCSB, I was a biology major because I was a crazed young bird watcher. And of course, hey, I'm a birder, I got to be a biology major. At least I thought I did. But fairly quickly, I realized, I actually like geography more as an academic pursuit. And part of that was biogeography, the distribution of plant and factors leading to those distributions. And I was always, since a young kid, a weather freak. I'd always look at the weather maps and look at what was happening. I grew up in New York. At least there was weather back there, actually. But anyway, and weather, which is meteorology, is geography. That's in the geography department. So I switched and became a geography major, and that's what my degree was in. And then I stayed and got a master's degree in geography at UCSB. And then I taught in the geography department for 10 years after that at environmental studies. But my love was meteorology and biogeography. And of course, weather is something also as a birder you should be really keyed into, because that improves your chances of seeing really cool stuff. And certain weather, for example, in the fall, like a nice marine layer 1,000 feet up, is really good for coastal migrants and better for vagrants, while a sunny skies and northwest winds, in the fall, you might get a flight of yellow-rumped warblers arriving and white-crowned sparrows, but it won't be very good for finding rare eastern vagrants, while that very stable marine layer weather is really better for that. So, and that's even Southern California, Santa Barbara and elsewhere, where our weather is a little more subtle. If you live back east, if you don't follow the progression of cold fronts and warm fronts and things like that, you won't know when to go out at the right time to hit a really good wave of migrants or improve your chances for rarities. So anyway, weather is also important to all this. So I had a love of biogeography, distribution, of course, bird distribution. And the other thing was I was a lister. I was a big time, lister. I ran all over Santa Barbara County working on my county list. I ran all over California, driving up to freaking Humboldt County or, whatever to chase a blue jay or something. With my friends Louis Bevere locally and a few others who I grew up birding with in Santa Barbara. But because of that, I traveled a lot. And I also became, for interest's sake, I worked on all my state lists. So it listing for me became an avenue. So most people, they go to Arizona, they go to Alaska, they go to Florida, they go to Maine, they go to Minnesota. Who the heck goes to Iowa, or Arkansas? Well, I did because I needed to work on my Arkansas list and my Iowa list. But by doing that, I would go not only to Iowa once, I'd go there at different seasons, and I would go to the corners. People gave me a nickname, State Corners Lehman, because if you're working on a state list, there's all sorts of birds that just come into the northeast corner of that state or just get into the southwest corner. So by doing that repeatedly, I learned bird distribution. And so how do you learn it? I got to tell you, there is no easy way. You cannot just pick up books. It's like reading the phone book and expecting to memorize people's phone numbers. You can't, okay, we'll get to Birds of Santa Barbara County, the thing I wrote, and it's online. But that's dense. I mean, I don't think anybody reads it for the fun of reading it. I mean, you go birding, you see a McGill of Ray's warbler at Carp Creek on the 15th of August, and you go, is that early? Should I see one on the 15th of August, or is that unusual? Well, you can either go sift through eBird data and see if there are other sightings there, or you can look at Birds of Santa Barbara County, which goes back to the dawn of time, not just when eBird got going after the year 2000, and see what I list for, or what's a typical arrival date for the south coast of Santa Barbara County, and what are the earliest dates. But you don't want to start reading page after page. Well, you do if you're an insomniac and you need to catch up on your sleep, but it's a source just to consult for answer a question. So you can, and of course there are books on the birds, not only of a county like Santa Barbara, but lots of states. So I have the state the birds of Iowa, the birds of Washington. So that's, if you lived in those areas or interested, you'd buy those. And again, you wouldn't read them for the fun of it, but they'd be there to consult. And so one source of learning bird distribution, of course, is the literature, but it's dense, and it's not like it's almost like reading the phone book. And another source is to have subscribed all these years to that magazine that Guy McCaskey was the regional editor to, called North American Birds Now, and read the regional report, not just your own area, not just Southern California, but other areas. The more, maybe you're interested in Arizona because you've been there recently, or Northern California, or, and then after a while you spread out and start reading more. And it's nothing you learn overnight. It's something that takes years and years to learn. I did not learn that academically. There was no bird, biogeography course at UCSB. This was all my own outside. But the absolute best way is to go there and bird an area. And when I would go there, I would go out with the best birders in the state, trying to, they'd help me find these state birds I wanted, or I just enjoyed birding with them. And what would we talk about in the car? Not our grandkids. Well, I don't have grandkids, but anyway, we talked about, oh, yeah, tell me about how are, ruffed grouse doing in your state? Are they up? Are they down? Or and how long have great-tailed grackles been here? And if they continued to spread, but so we would talk the talk sort of bird distribution, changing population. And that's how I learned. It's from the local experts. And that's how I learned it, was by all that travel. And that was an immense amount of travel. It started in the late 70s, and I did it particularly all through the 80s and all through the 90s, visiting all 49 states and all the provinces or almost all of Canada, and worked on and I'm over 50% in every state and province I visited, and often way ahead. I've slowed down like we all do when we get to a certain age, but so I don't do it hardly at all anymore, though I wish I could or would.
I'm curious, did you ever have a desire to like just do an ABA big year, like actually do this just in a formal, organized way for a whole year?
No, there was one year I did particularly. I was free for many months. I was teaching at UCSB, but I didn't get a teaching position for 2 quarters in a row. Something happened, so I had a lot of time. So just got in my car and I traveled for literally 5 or 6 months around the country. And by the end of the year, I had 650 or 700, but I didn't work on it. It's just I went all these places.
Yeah.
I once did a big year in California in the late 70s and only had to do it 1 year. And that cured me of the big year bug if it's too big an area. I mean, it's just nuts driving the amount of hours. So an ABA area, North American or state of California, forget it. The state of Delaware, okay, I'll do a big year. Santa Barbara County, big year, no problem. But some big area, I lost interest in that in a hurry.
I wanted to mention that for you talk about accumulating this information and it just takes a lifetime of study. And I've certainly noticed as I've birded with more expert birders, been privileged to bird with an expert birder, that they just have an incredible knowledge of status and distribution. They're just like walking encyclopedias of what birds are where, when. And I realize there's no shortcut, but for, lesser birders like me, I've certainly found that the distilled information in resources like your book, like Birds of Santa Barbara County, or even just in the range maps in the field guide, are not the level of detail you're talking about, but hugely helpful for someone who's coming with almost no information about status and distribution. And I am really curious to talk to you if you're willing about your work as the maps editor for the National Geographic Field Guide, because I know you've done that for a number of years. I remember when I got my first field guide that actually had range maps. I'd been working with the Peterson guide, which just had like a text description back in the day, and it was really hard for me to wrap my head around. But when I got I think it was the Golden Guide or whatever, the first guide I got that had the range maps, I was like, oh yes, this is what I needed. So and I know you've got this geography bent. I'm very curious about your take on range maps for birds in field guides and your own participation in getting those in there.
Yeah, that started for me, mostly the very late 80s, early 90s, after I'd been doing all this travel and people, started hiring me to do them. I was not a cartographer. So that did, again, academic, there was no academic background in map making for me. So it was my knowledge of bird distribution, not my map making skills. And yeah, it started with National Geographic, then the Peterson guides, the early Sibley guides, a couple of the other ones as well. But again, how do I do that? It's the personal knowledge I gained with all the things I just explained, plus have an extensive library. You can see a bunch of books behind me. I'd say 2/3 of the books, and that's only half, a quarter of the bookshelves you see behind my head. Those are mostly state bird books, regional bird books, and then I do have a lot of field guides to parts of the world, all around the world. But a lot of that is birds of, the birds of, and then fill in the blank books. And so I had that, and I have all the issues of North American birds back to the late 60s. But I gotta say, the thing which really helped was, again, I knew who to ask in every state and province based on my work with North American Birds Magazine and the regional editors and my travels and who I birded with. And so I would regularly tap those. There is nothing better than local expertise. There is no book, no magazine, no travel I can do living one place and travel that's still those local experts. And so I'd say, what's changed in the last 5 years? take a look at the latest edition. Let me know it needs fiddling and the like. And so that's the big secret weapon, I gotta say, beyond, looking at the literature, my own personal travels, North American birds, et cetera, et cetera. Now you add in the last 20 years, eBird, but I gotta say there's two problems with using eBird data to use range maps, and that's now all the rage. And a bunch of the books now are just going to use the eBird generated range maps, including National Geographic in their next upcoming editions. They're changing authors, changing artists, changing maps. That's another topic. I need to say I don't think it was a wise move, but that's my opinion. But two things eBird I think is weak on, and that is areas that are poorly sampled in eBird, therefore don't have very accurate range maps. So let's face it, Northwest Territories and Nunavut in Western Canada and parts of northern Alberta and Saskatchewan, just aren't very accurate because there's just not a lot of data. But there are birders there who know the area, but maybe they don't eBird. And then the other thing is, it's the edges. The core range, eBird does fine on. But those little fine nuances around the margins, some birds they do fine on, and others I think they're a little weak, especially if the bird is an ID issue. I wouldn't trust eBird maps on Impidinax flycatchers or something as far as I could throw them, to be honest. Now you'd say, wait a minute, but they're local regional editors, reviewers of the records. That's true. In some areas, the review process is very good, but in other areas, it's not so good. And in fact, that will be a topic I want to bring up as it relates to Santa Barbara County in a few minutes, about how it can still be full of wrong data. And part of it comes back to status and distribution, but also the review process. And it's only occasionally the fault of a reviewer isn't very good or just is too busy and can't spend enough time at it. The problem often is it's the filters, and the filters are, and I'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, I want to get into that in detail because I think that is something that just, everyday eBird users encounter, but they don't necessarily understand all the machinery behind it and what's going on there. And I think it does help to have an understanding of that. Okay, well, I think this is probably a good time to kind of pause and solicit questions. We're going to just sort of segue into talking about whatever you want to talk about next, but I'd like.
Well, let me just say one other thing. So
Sure.
status and distribution, both where the birds are and seasonally, to me and to a lot of birders, and you said, the really birder, they talk up, status distribution. To me, the best birders in North America, with no exception, are not only experts in bird identification, they're also really knowledgeable on status distribution, at least in their home area. Definitely be from coast to coast, and most aren't, but at least in their home region. And to me, those two things combined make them, to me, like the most knowledgeable and trustworthy observers out there. And the problem is, I can use a couple examples from Santa Barbara. There's the seasonal and geographic. So, for example, a Western gull, unbelievably abundant on the coast. You wouldn't think twice about looking at them twice. Of course, you should, because one of these days, a yellow-footed gull or a lesser blackback gull will show up, but that's besides the point. But if you then go to Lake Chuma or Gibraltar Reservoir and casually say, oh, there's a Western gull, and keep birding, well, I see those all the time in Carpinteria on the beach. Well, wait a minute. That would be an incredibly rare find, like the first record ever for Lake Chuma. And so people report a Western, hypothetically, but they didn't look at it carefully. And they then went home, and then maybe afterwards, an eBird reviewer says, wait a minute, what are the details? And then what you get sometimes is, I'm not saying this is Carpinteria birders at all, this is just hypothetical. Oh, I know Western gull well. Where I live, they're common. And that's their reason for why they got it right. Well, they didn't look at it carefully, and that's the key. They assumed, they didn't know it was unusual, and therefore, if you don't know something's unusual, you don't look at it extra carefully, and you are then prone to error, even if you know that bird well from somewhere else. So another example, seasonally, on the 25th of March, oh yeah, I heard a Western wood pewee calling. Well, Western wood pewees don't arrive till the 10th of April, and there's never been a valid March record, I think, in the state of California. But starlings give call notes that sound a lot like the peer of a pewee. And so, again, it's well, I know what a pewee sounds like, but the problem is you weren't aware at the time that it was unusual, and so you don't go, oh my God, I got to really listen carefully, get up even my phone and get a recording, whatever. And it just makes you prone to error, as much as not knowing how to identify, based on plumage characteristics. And as a reviewer for my whole life, and eBird reviewer, etc., I think that's the cause of as many or more errors in ID is either geographically it's not where it should be and you don't pay close attention, or seasonally. So anyway, that is so important to being a good birder and a trustworthy birder in the eyes of your peers, is knowing that info, at least on the local scale. Whether you go beyond and out to the whole state or other nearby counties, that who knows.
Well, and you were kind of, in some sense, talking down your own contribution in Santa Barbara, and your thesis, which became the book, Birds of Santa Barbara County. And I just want to make sure to do a plug for it, because for me, as a birder who's very focused in Santa Barbara County, it is just an invaluable resource for exactly those questions. When I see a species, I mean, if I'm smart, I've read the account beforehand, but these out of season or out of location sightings that are rare and need extra attention, if I know the account from Birds of Santa Barbara County for that species, I'm very well armed to make those kinds of judgments. And if I haven't, I'm not. So it's just an incredible resource to have available. I know you've updated it continuously since you first published your thesis. Just a few weeks ago, there was an updated edition, I think, the summer of 2024 edition. And I just, there's links to all these things that we're talking about in the notes for this meeting at carpbirdwatchers.org. Birds of Santa Barbara County is freely downloadable. Anybody who's bird watching in Santa Barbara County, certainly if they're avid listers, if they're out there trying to, find rarities or just really get a more thorough understanding of what's there, I just find it irreplaceable. Going through those accounts is just hugely helpful. And I want to take the opportunity to thank you on behalf of all the birders in Santa Barbara County, because the
Yeah, by
effort
the way,
is
so a
greatly
little funny story. The first iteration of it was my master's thesis. That was my master's thesis in geography, 1982 at UCSB. And a little funny story is, when I turned it in, finished all on the right kind of paper with the right margins, to the university librarian, she looked at me and smiled and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Lehman. You have submitted by far the longest master's thesis in the history of UCSB, never to be outdone." It was 650 pages, because it has to be, because how many species are in Santa Barbara County? So for a master's thesis, I set the all-time record. So anyway, then I updated it more in the early 90s, and actually published it as a book in 1994, the year I left Santa Barbara to go back east for quite a while. And then when I moved back to California, now 15 years, to San Diego, after a few years now, I started updating it, and then there's been as an online resource. And every year or so, and this year time, it took 2 years, I updated. And I tell you, it gets more and more complicated because it's not just using Dave Compton's seasonal reports that he writes, summary that he does for North American birds, which is what we used to use. But now it's a lot of eBird data that otherwise falls through the cracks. Dave doesn't catch or comes in late. That happens a lot, or is subtle, and it's a value for the book, but not necessarily for what he reports to Guy McCassie. It's never going to get published. It's not rare enough to be published in North American Birds, but oh my God, it's the latest record or the highest count for the Cuyama Valley of that bird. So therefore, I wanted to put in to illustrate, highs, lows, early, late in the Cuyama Valley versus on the coast in Carpinteria. So it's gotten more complicated as time has gone on because the volume has increased and the sources have become more and more, actually. You think it'd get easier, but it's actually probably more difficult.
I think there was a plea you put in the introductory material in the latest edition, or maybe it's from a previous edition, but talking about some of these accounts have just kind of swollen over time with all these, additional mentions like, oh, on this date, this bird, and this date, on this location, this bird, and it just kind of gets cumbersome after a while, and it needs to be, evaluated and condensed and summarized.
Right.
But that's a huge task, right? For,
Right.
500 plus species of birds.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, at some point, if there are 25 fall records for the coast of this bird, do I really need to list all 25 because it keeps growing? Or should I just say the first record ever was this? Since then, there have been 24 more records, with the earliest being this date here and the latest being that date there. Done. Is that good enough? It's nice to have all 25 listed individually, but oh my God, do you really want to have to sift through all that? So, yeah.
I mean, it's fun to see my own name in print. So for me, it's, oh yeah, list them all. But no, probably not that important to include them all. Okay, well, I do want to give a chance for Q&A, and I know we've got a bunch of species that you've raised with the reviewers. Like you kind of occasionally will send these messages to the eBird reviewers for the county, lamenting the profusion of unseasonal California gull reports or whatever, or I mean, ring-billed gull. Yeah. So, but I want to get to those. But I also want a chance to get, I'm sure people have questions for you. I haven't seen a bunch showing up in the chat. But I would like to kind of open the floodgates a little bit. And if people have questions for Paul about, status and distribution, yeah, I mean, if you've got your hand up, go ahead and unmute. And if we get too much of a logjam, we'll start playing traffic cop. But feel free to just jump in there. And if you're raising your hand, that's fine. Go ahead and unmute yourself and talk about, state your question.
Well, Paul, with changing climate, are you finding there's a corresponding shift in arrival and departure dates for species here or beyond?
Yes, but interestingly, it's a mixed bag. While generally things are getting warmer, some things have gotten earlier. I think using examples in Southern Cal, so all of you can relate. Hooded Oriole used to only arrive in early March. Now they're coming in late February, for example. I think warbling vireos, the same. I think hermit warblers, the first ones are arriving earlier. The first Hammond's flycatchers are earlier. But interestingly, some things almost seem to be coming a little later, and especially to our north. It's a general warming of the climate, but within that, you have these years that are, a cold spring. And so things run late. And there have been multiple cold springs in a row, it seems, up in the Pacific Northwest, resulting in large-scale mortality events of swallows. Everybody's lamenting the loss of swallows up in the Pacific Northwest, and rufous hummingbird numbers are way down. And so that doesn't affect the range map because the birds are still there. But of course, if I was doing an abundance range map, it would. But back east, a lot of stuff, warblers, some of the are already in numbers in late April, blah, blah, blah. I mean, so yes, some things are following the pattern you would think. Earlier in spring, surviving later in the late fall, early winter, even where it gets fairly cold. But interestingly, also some people, some species seems like spring, some stuff seems to run late. Or the peak flights are later, way into May in Santa Barbara. You get some really big flights of stuff on the 15th, 20th of May now. And not just peewees and Swainson's thrushes, which are notorious late migrants, but sometimes even just, hermits and black-throated grays and Townsend, some of the peak numbers are, and so it's interesting. It's not an easy to answer, earlier, or later in fall, earlier in spring. It's because of nuances regionally. Sometimes a region will have a cold spring or a warm fall, within the general pattern of a warming climate.
If I can just share
Heaven
something.
knows what's happening offshore with water. It's cold one year and then the next year it starts out cool and now it's warm off Southern Cal. I see Dave's online. You can comment on water temperature off Ventura, but it was cool off Santa Barbara, off San Diego, below normal all spring, and now we're above normal. So what's that doing to distribution of seabirds? And so and of course but that varies from year to year. So some things you can't map because it's not a continuous thing. There's these big fluctuations on a smaller time scale.
Yeah, and certainly for things like seabird, distribution trends, the data are very few. You've got these little expeditions that go out and maybe do a sampling, but you're not birding every day out there to really catch these. I want to mention something that Jamie Chavez put in the chat, not so much a question, but just an endorsement. So he wrote, I've been birding for going on 50 years, ouch, and I use Paul's book often throughout the year in my eBird reviewer role. It is invaluable. And yeah, I would certainly, again, endorse that. I'm a junior member of the reviewer team, and I see a lot of the discussions that go into things like these filter updates and trying to get a handle on these records that don't have a lot of documentation, but are, suspiciously early or late or in the wrong place.
Right.
And
so you mentioned Jamie and eBird review that he uses. So yeah, a little shout out to thanks to Jamie for all he does on eBird and also hosting my book on his website. But I think let me just mention, so eBird review, what a thankless job that is. I mentioned how good the filters are, and I'll be honest. Santa Barbara County, unfortunately, is a little behind the 8 ball on that because they only have one filter for the county. And some counties were grandfathered in early in the eBird review process where they had multiple filters in one county. San Diego, an example, we have 6 filters, offshore, immediate saltwater coast, coastal, plain, inland valley, mountains, and desert, separate filters. So if you had that for Lake Cachuma, you'd have an inland valley filter. And so if you went to Lake Cachuma and saw a western gull, it would be flagged and it would immediately tell you, this is rare here. You got to submit details. The problem is a number of counties only have one filter for the whole. It's a one-size-fits-all filter. LA County, which is incredibly diverse habitat-wise, like San Diego, all the way from offshore to the desert via high mountains, only has one filter. Ventura, Dave can commiserate, has one filter. Santa Barbara, one filter. San Luis Obispo, one filter. So you sort of have to, okay, what do you put for what's rare? What's the number of individuals that triggers a high count? And so if somebody reports a western gull in New Quiyama at the sewage plant, it won't get flagged because you're not going to set Western Gull to 0. So you catch the first record from the Cuyama, because obviously you don't want to review every coastal beach Western Gull record, and so you have to find them other way. You have to dig into the individual data. While if you had a filter system that could cut counties finer scale, that would make your life much easier. And so, and unfortunately, eBird's not I don't know why they won't, but those who had it already were grandfathered in, and those who came along later and said, oh, I'd like to make, at least divide Santa Barbara into the 4 or 5 regions that my book is: South Coast, North Coast, inland, mountains, and Cuyama. That'd be great, and then somebody would have to sit down and spend hours and hours and hours constructing all those individual filters. But that would make the data even cleaner, than it is. And more things would get flagged that should be and not slip through the cracks to be discovered by some other method
and it gives
later
you
on. Now, Jamie might have he may have input on that I'm misspeaking in some way, but that is a thing where the counties are uneven. Even if the reviewers are as dedicated as they come, there's only so much you can do if your filter is a very broad brush one versus a very specific one.
Yeah, and I mean, logistically, I know they don't have a huge team building out and supporting eBird, so I'm sure they have a long list of features they'd like to add, but that would be such a huge benefit, and being able to kind of reach out to the user who's entering their data and just alerting them like, oh, wait a second, this thing you're entering, I mean, it's a little annoying for the user to have that rarity filter pop up and say, oh, can you please provide additional information? But it's crucial, and especially if you can make it specific, within the sub-county level, that would just be a huge benefit, I would think. I saw you had your hand up earlier, Mark Holmgren.
Yeah.
Did you have a question?
I do, and there's an element of this discussion that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is that I fear that Paul's book is going to be ever so slightly less less the resource that we go to, because we have the bar chart. And in the last 6 weeks, Paul has been working aggressively, as you know, John, with the reviewers to try to ferret out the information that needs to be culled, and to make these bar charts the resource that may be the first resource we go to. And then Paul's book may be the one that amplifies and provides the additional data. But these bar charts are really incredible if they're well curated by the reviewers. And given Steve Caldwell's new software that Paul has adopted and is now using to find outlandish records, or records that need better support or better substantiation, or that need to be removed perhaps from the bar chart, this bar chart is becoming incredibly reliable. And but it is, again, for the entire county. It's not for the desert or Lake Cachuma or any place like that. But it is a resource that may be easier to access when you're in the field than the book is. Even though I carry a copy of the book on my cell phone, and I find it very easy to go to, and I frequently refer to the book when I'm in the field. But the bar charts is something, and I'll post the link to the bar charts on the chat line so that everybody can put this on their cell phone and take a look at it. It really may be a little bit easier than Paul's book to go to as a first resource, but nothing beats Paul's book as an ultimate resource. And again, I want to say thanks to Paul for this recent update and for all the updates, because I don't know any other county who has this kind of, or very few counties have this kind of backup and reference to refer to. So it's incredibly important. But I'll post the bar chart link.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention that, again, in the notes for this meeting, there is a link to the page at the eBird website that gives those bar charts for Santa Barbara County, which we've covered them a ton of times in these meetings. But as Mark is pointing out, if there are extraneous or questionable records in there, those bar charts can be a little misleading if there's stuff around the edges that should not actually be there. And again, just as part of kind of throwing out a few thanks for the thankless reviewer job, it is true that Paul has been going over the last few months, I want to say, sending these emails to the eBird review, Santa Barbara County eBird reviewer email list of just going species by species through the whole set of eBird records using Steve Colwell's bird view in part. And I see Steve just entered the meeting. So you mentioned Steve and he shows up, which is kind of cool.
Well, I just mentioned it to him on
yeah. Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
But again, you know, these long emails where he's going through and drilling down and saying, okay, where are all the records for this species? Where are they physically within the county? Where are they in terms of the date? And calling out a bunch of outliers that maybe are questionable. And you know, hugely helpful, hugely effortful. Like I can't imagine, you know, that amidst all the other things you're doing, you're finding hours and hours to comb through the records of eBird sightings in Santa Barbara County in this effort to kind of clean up the data. But I very much appreciate it. On behalf of the birders who rely on those bar charts, thank you for doing it.
I think it's worth mentioning that just to let everybody else feel a little bit more comfortable is that Paul has found a lot of our own records, reviewers' records, and it's been a little bit humiliating, but you know, all for the better. And bar chart is now very respectable, really much more accurate than it was even a month ago. And so it's clean and it's a little bit not intuitive, you know, why you know a 14 March Western wood peewee isn't acceptable. Hey, you know, birds show up, you know, anything can happen in nature. Well, it's not true. The statistics are so improbable that a bird will show up that's way outside what's shown in the bar chart that you can really trust it to a large degree. And it's your first and maybe your best first glance to tell you if you're on track with what you think you're seeing or what you're, you know, or what you're not really getting correct.
And by the way, this is a never-ending process. Reviewing the eBird. I mean, Mark's saying, yeah, everything is great. Well, there's still undoubtedly records that need to be culled and things that need to be double-checked. It will never end. Obviously, the volume will hopefully go down, but it is a never-ending process to try to, because the volume is so huge, you know. So, and it keeps coming.
So again, I'm watching the clock and I want to get to some of these specific species that you have concerns about. Can we do maybe a quick lightning round?
Yeah,
some of these species.
3 or 4. I mean, I'd start with a few and then people can mention. I mean, I only have 30 seconds to say, but my favorite birds on what are misreported, some of them are resident birds where they don't belong, of a bird that just doesn't move, you know, or, you know, almost never moves. But it's often by visiting birds who don't know better. So for example, there are multiple reports with no details of rufous crowned sparrows at the bird refuge. Well, most of those are probably people who don't know any better seeing young white crowns that have rufous on the crown. But as Mark said, birds can turn, you know, some things happen. There is actually once a good rufous crowned sparrow was photographed at the bird refuge several years ago in late summer, probably a juvenile kicked out of its natal, you know, territory and had to find. So it does happen, but that's a common thing that causes, you know, and you'll have examples elsewhere in the county. But 2 or 3 that I particularly like, the one that's true everywhere in California is in summer, people report far too many ring-billed gulls. And what they're seeing are young, ratty California gulls with bicolored bills. You know, pink-based, dark tip. Ring-billed gull in the summer is actually pretty darn uncommon. And California gull is common. Lots of California gull non-breeders spend the summer on the California coast. Ring-billed is actually, especially if you're on the outer beach where all the California gulls are, they're rare. So where do you see 1 or 2 ring-bills in the summer? Lake Los Caneros. Lake Cachuma, maybe the mouth of Carp Creek, there's one. But if you're looking at the beach at the harbor, those are 99% California gulls, or not ignoring Westerns and Hermans. And so, but that is commonly, people will report, somebody will go to the harbor and they'll see 15 ring-billed gulls on the 15th of June and 0 California gulls. And that is an automatic red flag with no Californias, but a bunch of ring-bills. Another example is I think it's a total mess. And I think every database, every eBird database in every county in California is messed up. And that's Rufus and Allen's hummingbirds. And that is people over-report Rufus hummingbird. Rufus hummingbird, I think, has become pretty uncommon. Their numbers are down. And people will report them in like midwinter before they start coming back, starting the end of January, early February. So let's say on a Christmas count. And here's a classic example of knowing status distribution. Rufus hummingbird is now rare. October, November, December, January. It is plain rare. And Allen's has become common, fairly common. And so what happens is somebody gets a fairly quick or incomplete, or they're looking up at an angle at a high perched male hummingbird that has a bunch of Rufus on it. And they say, oh, look at all that Rufus. That's a Rufus hummingbird. And they report it as a Rufus hummingbird. But they really didn't carefully look at it because they didn't know that they're rare in winter. And they've declined. And then Allen's has exploded in numbers in the past decade or two. And what the problem is, they miss the uppermost back, which on some Allen's, that's the only place they're green, is on the upper back. Not the lower back, nowhere else. And so I think Rufus hummingbird is terribly overreported. And that's a combination of either not knowing the ID characters or particularly not knowing status and distribution and the seasonal status. And then last example I'll just throw out, which is true in San Diego, it's true in Santa Barbara, and that's one of the birds we got rid of a bunch of the records from eBird on, including several by the eBird reviewers themselves who said, you know what, forget it. And that is American goldfinch. American goldfinch, if you grew up back east and then you moved to California, oh, they're American goldfinch, they're everywhere, they're common. Well, in fact, American goldfinch in a lot of places are uncommon in California, may be fairly common, but they're really local and they're mostly coastal. You go inland and they're small localized numbers in riparian in the San Ynez Valley. And that's it. I mean, you go to the mountains, there should not be any or almost none American goldfinch, but people just have in their head that American goldfinch is a common widespread bird. And so they report them from the top of Figueroa Mountain or from the Cuyama Valley. And maybe you get them in October, November, a couple, but totally overreported. And again, sort of like the ring-billed thing, if there are no California gulls, that's a red flag. If somebody goes to Figueroa Mountain and reports 5 American goldfinches and no lesser goldfinches, that's a red flag, because lesser is fairly common up in the grassier areas of, up in the mountains. And so there's an example of, we all know that if you go out and see a tricolored heron, well, that's rare. And but these subtle birds like a ring-billed gull in midsummer or American goldfinch, really anywhere away from coastal riparian areas, you really need to do a second look at them. That's where status and distribution and where we really culled a whole bunch of American goldfinch records, and the problem is a lot of these, they're 20-year-old records or 10-year-old. You can't go back and say, what did you see? Because the person, they don't remember a goldfinch, but they didn't even think it was at all unusual. So they didn't. Just one last example. Again, a bird that is so common, people don't think twice about it, is crows. And American crow. Well, there are crows everywhere. Well, you know what? People would go out to the Channel Islands and they'd report crows. Well, there aren't. Now there's a little group of crows on Santa Cruz Island that maybe they're starting. But otherwise, it's all ravens out there and people would report crows. Same in the Cuyama Valley. Crows are rare in the floor of the Cuyama Valley, and people go and report crows because they're not thinking. They're saying, oh, I'm just used to seeing crows all over Carpinteria or Santa Barbara. And this, so there's another example of a really common bird that has the nuances of a regional change that if you don't know the status, just you don't take a second look. At the end of the day, you get home, you do your list for the Cuyama Valley, you stick a few crows on it, and in fact, you didn't see crows. They were all ravens all day long, and then the data has to be, cleansed later on.
Paul, what are people confusing American goldfinch with? All just lesser
goldfinch.
Pretty much all the time?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, not an adult male and breeding plumage American, but anything winter, a lesser goldfinch. Some of them have blacker, some lessers may have blacker wings and the wing bars look bolder, or the yellow is somewhat restricted underneath, and you think it's a female American goldfinch. Oh yeah, the confusion is lesser goldfinch for sure.
Can I get you to weigh in on one of my own pet peeves, which is the unseasonal ruby-crowned kinglet report?
Yeah, ruby-crowned kinglets, depart the first couple days in May is the last time you should see a ruby-crowned kinglet, and they don't come back usually till late September, the first ones, and even October when you start getting numbers of them. And you get reports on the 15th of May or the 1st of June. And almost invariably, those are, poorly seen Hutton's vireos. Well, some Hutton's vireos don't look all that big. They look kind of cute. And sometimes Hutton's vireos flick their wings like ruby-crowned kinglets do. But people just assume, oh, I see kinglets, 9 months out of the year or 8 months. And so anyway, the bottom line is they don't look again. They do a 1 second, oh, that's a ruby-crowned kinglet, move on. It goes on the list, submitted. And if they knew, there shouldn't be a ruby-crowned kinglet here on the 25th of May. They should have left 3 weeks or, a month ago, the last one. They would go, oh, wait a minute. And then they would look, and then they'd look at the wing bars. They'd look at the laurel. They do what they need to then properly identify it. So yes, that's one that a seasonal thing that without knowing that seasonal distribution, you go down the wrong path.
Mark, did you have another question or comment?
It occurs to me that we now know that status and distribution is incredibly important, but there's one other element that may become well known as being almost as important, and that is molt. And so with that in mind, I want to ask Paul a question that I have is the short-billed and long-billed dowitcher situation. We know that feathers are only good when those birds, to distinguish the two species, when those birds are in juvenile plumage. And, but I've come across this situation where how late in the fall can I use that feature to look at the difference between, and to be certain that the bird is still in juvenile plumage? In other words, do they begin to molt to their basic winter plumage by what date?
That is variable from bird to bird and location to location. For example, a short-billed dowitcher in Santa Barbara County, since no short-billed dowitchers winter in Santa Barbara County, they will not molt until they basically reach the winter ground. So a juvenile short-billed dowitcher will still have juvenile plumage in Santa Barbara County. Lots of short-billed dowitchers winter on San Diego Bay here in San Diego. So we see the short-billed juveniles arriving now, and some of them are already molting out of juvenile plumage in September because they're just going to winter here, or maybe in Ensenada, somewhere close. And so they start molting out. Having said that, you can still see short-billed dowitchers with the crucial feathers in question well into November, still with those juvenile tertial feathers. So it's a mark as long as you know where those feathers are and can look. So yeah, the state of plumage or being able to age. So here we are right now, August, the peak of interesting shorebird migration. And when you're looking for rare shorebirds, you're looking for semi-palmated sandpiper, for example, among all the westerns at Devereux Slough or somewhere else. Well, 99.99% of the semi-sandpipers in August that you will find are juveniles. There aren't any adults now. So if you don't know how to age a juvenile shorebird or a shorebird, you won't then be able to find the rare one because you won't have the search image. I'm going to ignore all the adult peat because that's not what, the same with Baird sandpiper in August and September. They're all juveniles. So I want to key in on what the juvenile plumage is. So actually knowing how to do these plumages and the status of molt is crucial in not only proper ID, but just looking for these birds. Same with true of some cryptic species offshore. What status of molt they're in might determine what species they are.
There's another question that Jamie Chavez put in the chat. Does Paul have an opinion on what parts of the county are really lacking good status and distribution information?
Yeah.
Well, we're fixing the valley. We're fixing
Is what?
the valley. We're getting someplace.
Yeah,
cleaning up the valley.
I think there's been a lot of improvement in the areas that I would have easily come up with an answer 20 years ago. San Ynez Valley doing much better now than 20 years ago. The Cuyama Valley in just the last few years, people have taken Linus Blomquist with his surveys and some of the UCSB kids going out there regularly, et cetera, et cetera. So, and there was a guy who lived there who passed away in the last couple of years, Steve, another different Steve. So that area is coming along. I'd say the mountains, especially maybe, Sierra Madre, but it's hard to get. Of course, the San Rafael Mountains, because they're just so darn difficult to get to, especially in the off season. I mean, for example, those summer surveys that have been done on Big Pine Mountain for year after year, but now in the last 2-3 years, they've gotten more difficult to do. So we have a pretty good data set on sort of late June, early July on Big Pine Mountain on what's there. But we don't know much about San Rafael and Medulce and some of the trail, and the upper elevations of the Sierra Madre. We also, what about migration? Now, I haven't even heard yet. This is a topic I want to get in, but this latest fire, how bad did it destroy what little bit of habitat was left, on Ranger Peak and a little bit on Figueroa. But I think it would be a great study to go up in the mountains and we used to get some really good flights of tanagers and stuff in early May in the high mountains. What about the fall? A lot of hermits and Townsends and Rufous hummingbirds and BT grays and Hammond's flycatchers come through the mountains in the fall. But I got to admit, when the fall came along, I was on the coast all the time. I didn't go to the mountains. So we don't have a good handle on what the fall migration through the mountains when the the late season flowers are blooming and stuff. That's not known. Point Conception was poorly known, but now that a few people have access there and are doing some work, because that just geographically is dynamite, for what might be occurring there. Obviously, also the morning flight idea that we didn't do it all. And when I lived in Santa Barbara, that's something that's only happened in the last 10, 15 years of morning flight in spring with big flights in LA and down here in San Diego to some extent. But obviously there are people going either San Marcos Pass or particularly Refugio and doing this morning flight thing, which is shattering, high counts of migrants, far exceeding what we used to know. So that's a great thing that's come along just the last few years. And then in the fall, the raptor migration thing and black swifts in spring and the raptors there in the foothills behind Carpinteria and Summerland and Montecito. And all of a sudden, a bird that was thought to be incredibly rare, the broadwing hawk and Swainson's hawk, is like, oh yeah, only 20 broadwings this year, went by the foothill spots in the fall there that the people are doing. So there are still places, but man, it has come a long way. There's been some great work done in places that were poorly known just 10, 20 years ago. So the list is definitely shrinking.
Well, there's that old expression. I forget who the quote is attributed to, but if I see so far, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants. You've certainly established a huge, baseline of detailed information, and if people are adding more information around the edges, it's in part a tribute to the work you did.
With all the travel I did and gave talks on bird distribution, migration, hotspots, a question that people asked me repeatedly was, Paul, what makes a really good birding hotspot? A really good migrant spot, a birding hotspot. And I smiled and said, any place that gets adequate coverage. So, and there's a certain level of truth to that. It can be a freaking cornfield in Iowa, but if it gets enough coverage, you might learn some stuff. So that's certainly the case in Santa Barbara County. Is adequate coverage it's yes, there's geography, yes, there's time of year, yes, it's the proper weather conditions, but just getting coverage will elevate a place from so-so to one of the hot spots everybody wants to go to.
The Patagonia
no
picnic
portion
table.
of the county, no portion of the county has progressed as fast as pelagic knowledge.
Yeah.
Thanks to Perexta and many others who've been leading trips and all over the state. We're learning so much more about pelagic bird distribution, and especially in Santa Barbara County.
Yep.
I see you turned on your camera, Dave. Did you want to make any comments in response
I'm
to
gonna
that?
say that Santa Barbara County is now the hotspot for streak shearwaters and this side of the ocean. So yeah, just anytime we go
Although,
out.
what do you think the chances are it's the same bird from a year or two ago? Same spot, right?
Yeah, I think highly likely.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I've seen that bird twice now. How exciting.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be on both those trips. Okay, well, we've gone pretty much as long as we would normally have time for. I want to have room for a few more questions. I think Laurel, you raised a hand.
And Steve Cowell too.
Yeah, okay, so if you've raised a hand, please go ahead and unmute and get your question or comment out there. This is our last call for
I
questions.
didn't. That was a mistake.
Okay. Well,
I was
glad it worked.
This is Steve. I was just going to ask about the deeper ocean. It sure would be nice to get out further, like where the cruise ships go at the times when the cruise ships aren't around. What's out there?
I agree. The cruise ships, there's a very narrow window. The problem is out there is it's often so rough or uncertain what the conditions are going to be that only a cruise ship could do it. And Dave can attest, or to the old Condor Express days of going to those western Santa Barbara County waters, and you always had your fingers crossed 5 times over that the conditions would let you get out there. But just think for a second, let's say Dave does 2 trips a year out of Ventura, Nick does 1 or 2. They only go now south of the islands. It's on one day. It's one boat doing one transect that visits that water for about 1 minute or 2 minutes, and it's on. And that's our data set, and look what's found. But imagine if there were, like said, if there were daily trips out offshore or every few days, we would realize that, hell, maybe streak shorewater's annual. Well, probably not, but birds that we still think are rare, or not, Creveri's merlets, or even Guadalupe merlets, or Townsend storm petrels, or tropic birds and skuas and laysands, it's like, oh yeah, I mean, you only had one, you didn't have five, or, it's when you think about how a minuscule percent of the ocean we are sampling with a handful of trips on single days, it is, what's out there is, heaven knows.
And I will put in a plug for some of the seabird stuff. Couple things real quick. I am trying to get more trips out and trips to the deeper parts of Santa Barbara County. The Condor Express has been ghosting me because I asked about doing a trip and they're like, oh, we'll be happy to do an 8-hour trip. I said, well, how about a 10-hour trip? And then they're like, well, it's going to be expensive. And I said, people, you have to tell me what it's going to cost, and people will pay it, or we'll come up with a way to do this. And then they just started ghosting me. And now I'm going to see them in a couple weeks for the ACS trip. So I finally sent them a text. I'm like, I know you haven't responded to me, but I'm going to see you in a couple weeks, right? So we have to come to some understanding on this. But, I'm trying to put trips together and more out of Ventura. Joel and I have talked about doing booby trips, just a couple trips, 2-3 trips a year to Santa Barbara Island. And I can't get that from them, a dedicated trip. Nick's been able to do it because he can charter on an island landing, right? But we're trying. But even with some of the data we have, what is exciting is I'm co-authored on 2 different papers now on booby expansion. So one specific to Santa Barbara Island and the colony that's developed there, and another kind of just on the expansion of all these different booby species into Southern California. And there's some science out there, scientific data that's available from cruises, but a lot of it's eBird data, and that stuff has added up. And so as much as being an eBird reviewer can be pretty thankful, and Paul especially, and myself and others get frustrated at sometimes the lack of quality of data and understanding, some of these species and being able to distinguish them. But like people putting in Nazca boobies from the expansion of that species that really started up here in like 2017. And I show this in one of my scientific talks I do, right? That like, well, if we had to rely on scientific data collection, here's what we'd know about Nazca boobies. But here's what eBird shows, right? And there's just this huge amount of stuff in there that has been quality checked. And even 2 of my records have been, rejected because there was questions about the age of the bird or whatever. But there's all this stuff there, and we're harvesting it and doing some cool things with it. So but anyway,
Yeah,
I'm trying to do more for pelagic birds. And if anyone wanted to tell the Condor Express that they wanted more trips out of Santa Barbara, or tell Island Packers they want, trips to go see the booby colony, maybe that would have an impact. So
yeah, and certainly I appreciate personally the efforts you're making, and wish you well going forward. And if my thanks account for anything in the thankless task category, I do thank you very much for that, because it's been a huge part of my birding experience, the way it's expanded to include pelagic birds based on trips that you've organized. So, and it's been very memorable and just irreplaceable. Very much appreciated. And so I do want to wrap things up because we're kind of out of time. But again, last call for questions for Paul. Anything else out there?
A quick question. The Carpinteria librarian asked if you would ever have a hard, a regular book on the birds of Santa Barbara in the updated version.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you go on Amazon, there is a copy you can buy for like $100. There's like an original edition that someone has
Oh, well, I mean, that's 1994. Things have changed a bit, shall we say. So other than to have it sit on your bookshelf anyway. I think online is fine. I'll tell you, if there was one, it would need 2 things. It would need, as Mark mentioned, or somebody, John maybe, about the need to simplify. So it's not, I mean, it's huge now. It would have to be shortened. But the other thing is, one thing I'd love to do is add a whole bunch of photos. Photos of cool bird. I mean, a lot of the rarities that have occurred are just nice. I don't need a photo of a female house finch probably, but the tricolored blackbirds are nice, or Lawrence's goldfinches, but then a lot of rarities or big concentrations or numbers of birds. Just that would be nice, and nice color photos of habitat, all the habitat types in the county, and that would be a massive undertaking. God knows, I'd have to stop birding and just do that.
Well, we don't want that, but
And that's why I did a lot of this eBird review stuff in the summer, because summer's a little quieter and it was getting too warm around here. Now that late August and the beginning of September is almost here, forget it. I have other things to do. I'm gonna be out birding more.
very much so. All right. Well, I want to close the meeting, but I want to thank Paul, and I'm sure I'm speaking for all the participants in this meeting and anyone who might view it in the future, that this has been just fascinating and a very interesting insight into a very important topic for bird watchers and bird watchers of Santa Barbara County in particular. And just my profuse thanks to you for doing the meeting and for all the thousands of hours of effort you have put into making the birding process better for other birders.
Here, here. Here,
Thank
here.
you, Paul.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Good night.
Well, just before you go, one quick
Yeah.
housekeeping note. This meeting will be archived, will be available at carpbirdwatchers.org. If you give me about 24 hours, it takes a little while with YouTube's editing feature for these live streams, but I will make sure there is a family-friendly version of this meeting available, so you can direct people to it, with a clear conscience. It's not going to be as shocking as it might otherwise be, and just it's the good information, not the extraneous stuff, will be there again within about 24 hours. So
Thank you, John.
yeah, thank you
Thank
all.
you.
All for participating.
Okay.
And
Bye-bye.
we'll see you out there.